Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, they, he, she, and today we are looking at and talking about Anti-Capitalist Resistance by Gord Hill, published by Arsenal Pulp Press in 2012. Content notes for state violence, discourse about breaking windows, and resistance. Anti-fascism if you happen to be the sensitive sort. For a full creator bio, check out my first review of Hill's work, namely the 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book. In addition, I would recommend all y'all to check out Hill's most recent book, the anti-fascist comic book, 100 Years of Fascism and Anti-Fascist Movements, which is kind of a full development of many of the threads started in this earlier book. What kinds of keywords came to mind rereading this book? Anti-globalization, WTO, Summit of the Americas, G8, anti-Olympic resistance, and breaking windows. The official synopsis is, quote, "In recent years, the world has borne witness to numerous confrontations, many of them violent, between protesters and authorities at pivotal gatherings of the world political and economic leaders. While police and the media are quick to paint participants as anarchist thugs, accurate accounts of their subsequent treatment at the hands of authorities often go untold, as well as the myriad stories of corporate and government corruption, greed, exploitation, and abuse of power that inspired such protests in the first place. In this startling, politically astute graphic novel, Gord Hill documents the history of capitalism as well as anti-capitalist and anti-globalization movements around the world, from 1999 Battle of Seattle against the World Trade Organization to the Toronto G20 summit in 2010. The dramatic accounts trace the global origin of public protests against those in power, then depict recent events based on eyewitness testimony. They go far to contradict the myths of violence perpetrated by authorities and instead paint a vivid and historically accurate picture of activists who bring the crimes of government and multinationals to the world's attention. As the Occupy movement around the world unfolds, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book is a deft, eye-opening look at the new class warfare and those brave enough to wage the battle." End quote. As with all of Hill's books, this particular volume can feel like a very brief overview of many really interesting and important events, although that's certainly not a critique, just an observation and an acknowledgement of my own interest in knowing more. Keeping things short and punchy certainly increases its general appeal and approachability. That said, out of the three of them, this one felt the most tied to the time it was produced in, although anti-Olympic resistance and or anti-World Summit resistance could become much more relevant to the discourse at any moment, and knowing the history of resistance of all kinds can be useful. It just felt a little less urgently relevant than the anti-fascist and or indigenous resistance books, is all. An easy-to-read comic with dynamic art, this is definitely one of those comic books that pretty much anyone could pick up. Looking at the different points of representation, for me the most distinct focus was on class conflict from the perspective of the working class, which is not something that comes up nearly enough in my reading. Race was much less of a focus in this volume than in either of Hill's other books. Looking at gender, while not an explicit focus of the book, and no one is actually going around discussing their gender, we do have a fair amount of representation of flat-chested people and people who have boobs, participating in activism of all kinds. As with his other books, there could have been representation of visibly disabled people in crowd scenes. Sexuality was ignored across the spectrum, so that seems fair. To conclude, revisiting this particular volume, I do think I have more of an appreciation for what it was trying to do than I did the first time I read it, so I'm going with 4 stars. Bio, keep reading Unorganized and Capitalist Oppression. And as always, Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.